A big hello to all my movie hunters. My name is Dusan, and today we have a very special episode because my guest is David, better known as Viking Samurai. David, hello, and thank you. It's great to have you here. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. This is going to be a fun topic to talk about, no doubt.
Yeah. David and I go a long way back because we talked a lot of times about action movies in 80s and 90s. And this is all the kind of stuff that we usually talk in my channel because it's interesting that all these action movies, they don't look the way they used to. And it's not just because the new movie stars are not action heroes. We only have stars that occasionally make action movies.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have that real action heroes, those people larger than life, those real stars like Schwarzenegger and Stallone, Van Damme, Seagal, that Mount Rushmore from your channel. So it's interesting that all these movies look so generic. And the problem is, when you watch it, you already know what's going to happen. And it becomes sillier and sillier every time because they simply don't take themselves too serious. They know they're in action movie, and that's not really interesting enough for real audience because these new generations are not used to that 80s and 90s style that we used to have. So what do you think what's missing in these action movies of today?
Yeah, well, just to start off, I think it's important to define what an action film is because it has evolved. Like if you go back 100 years, really the Western movies were action films. Nowadays it's comic book films. But I think when most people talk about like a pure action film, they do bring it back to kind of like the 80s and 90s because that's where it evolved. And I think they even coined the term action film when you get stuff like Lethal Weapon, Die Hard, when you get real action stars like Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Van Damme, Seagal, of course, all on the Mount Rushmore of action, right? And so I think the thing missing, to me, any movie, like the most important thing despite genre is the character. But in the action film genre specifically, I think there's something a little more important, but it's related to the character. It's the actual star, the actor, but more so the star, not so much the actor, but the star. And when you talk about like an Arnold movie, you kind of know what to expect just based on Arnold or Stallone. Now, obviously, they did kind of branch out and do some other genres. Arnold with like comedy, at least he tried, right? Wasn't as successful as the action stuff. But in general, like these men were the genre more so than the characters they portrayed, right?
Absolutely.
And that's really what's missing for whatever reason. And the way it's evolved now, like I don't think people even care about the actors in these comic book films. You don't watch the new Batman because of Robert Pattinson. You watch it because it's Batman. That's why I watch it. I thought he did a pretty good job, but I'm not watching it because of him.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas back in the 80s and 90s, you are specifically watching Commando because of Arnold Schwarzenegger. You're watching Rambo because of Stallone. You're watching Death Warrant, that poster behind you, because of Van Damme. You just don't get that these days anymore. And these guys were larger than life personalities. Whereas now, they'll occasionally do some pretty good action films like John Wick. I think Keanu Reeves does amazing in that. My favorite action film over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, I would say, would be Extraction with Hemsworth. Now, obviously, people know him more for the Thor character, but Extraction's like, in my opinion, more of a real action film, right? Like, and they did everything just right. So what's missing is really just that larger than life personality that they seem like they could really do that stuff in real life, right? Like the suspension of disbelief, you're already there because like Steven Seagal, for example, in Under Siege, because of like the mythology of Steven Seagal and his background, it was good enough where you thought, I think this guy could really do that in real life. And then just watching him in the film was that much funner and more believable.
Every time when he mentioned, I used to be an ex-CIA agent or whatever. Every time you believe, you see, and the way that he handles the weapons and all that stuff, and marked for death when he was, gearing up for that final fight that he had. You see in his moves that the guy knows this stuff. He used to work with it. It's obvious. And the sad thing is, we still count on guys who are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Harrison Ford is already 80 and he's doing Indiana Jones 5. We don't have these young stars who are, like I said, they don't have enough strength and they don't look powerful enough to take these roles. you know, aside from Chris Hemsworth and Henry Cavill, that's it. We have like maybe Jason Momoa, and that's it. Only those three actors are capable enough to look a certain way that we expect those heroes to be. Everyone else, you know, they need to prep for the role, and immediately when it's done, they let themselves go. And that's the problem, because you're a martial artist, you are a natural bodybuilder, and you know this stuff. You know that you have to work constantly in your body to keep yourself in good shape and to work on it day after day. They see it only as an obligation during that time, just to pump up for the role, no questions asked, the way they, you know, that's it. And here, practically of those older action heroes that are now, are Vin Diesel and The Rock, and both of them take silly roles. You know, when you watch these movies, you think, you know, this is more of a comedy, action comedy, rather than an action movie. And when you watch these movies, you can see it's the same character all over again, and they usually don't even get hurt. And everything they do in a movie, it just looks like so fake. They don't invest themselves in it, you know. What, do you agree with me? Or
I do agree with you, and that has to do with a couple of reasons. For one, when you say it kind of feels fake, I mean, a lot of the time they just shoot this stuff in front of a green screen. Mm-hmm. Back in the day, like, it's real because they literally filmed it. Like, if you go to Rambo First Blood Part 2 with you know, Stallone, the Rambo character, mm-hmm. running and jumping off that cliff, and there's that big explosion and bomb, and he's diving in the waterfall, it's like, I don't know if that was Stallone doing it or not, but a guy literally did that and they filmed it. It's like, it brings that level of realism. And just going back to what you said about these guys who were forging their bodies, like Stallone and Schwarzenegger, like they lived that life outside of the movies. And same with Van Damme and Seagal with the martial arts. It's like, so to capture that like realism in the film, it's like, these are kind of like the real guys outside of the films. But then obviously you put them in a movie that you got to highly dramatize things and exaggerate things. But there is that level of realism because it's like these guys do that stuff in real life in a way. Now, obviously not to the extent of what's shown in a film, but they are that type that you could get totally lost in it. And you're like, yeah, this is, if there was a guy that could pull this off, this would be the guy in real life.
The same thing goes for Van Damme and Dolph. Both were karate champions. And you can see in their moves, they were professionals at it. They're real athletes. And when you put them in an action role, you immediately believe everything is possible. And when you see them in action, you know it's the real stuff. So there was no need for stuntman. Or no, you know, there were probably some scenes where they used them, you know, not to get hurt. But you can see it was them, you know, it were them all along. All those action scenes were captivating because the moment you start using CGI, you're losing it. You're losing the audience, you're losing the attention, and you're losing that believability that certain characters can do all that stuff.
And they also will, again, this goes to just the way they film it, because they will use a lot more stuntmen, right? That they'll use the shaky cam method. And it's just like, you know, jarring and it's confusing. So a good action film, you got to be able to follow the action. And when you're just like shaking the camera, doing all these fast cuts, it's hard to follow. It really is. Whereas like in Bloodsport, you pull the camera back, Van Damme could literally do all this stuff, and it's very easy to follow. And of course, the score and the editing and the slow-mo adds so much. But these days, it's like they try to rush everything. And a lot of it's because people have ADD. They got a short attention span, you know, and it feels like a video game. That also goes with the choreography, too. I think if action films are overly choreographed, then it comes across more like a dance. Like you don't feel the guy's actually in danger. You got to capture all those like little moments between the fighting, you know, and like when the guys are getting hurt, like Lionheart, for example, and Van Damme's character, when Attila finds out that he's got that broken rib coming in the fight, like the pacing is beautiful. You could see Joshua's reaction shot, like, oh shit, you know, like all this stuff. Nowadays, it's like these two bulls just going full on nonstop. It's like you don't capture all those real dramatic moments that make you remember it, right? And then you feel all those like hits and everything. So there's a lot of acting within the action that I don't think they really do as much these days because they rush everything.
Just when you mentioned those memorable moments, we don't have them in action movies anymore, you know. When we were kids, you remember certain scenes and they go deep in your mind in, just like Van Damme, that last fight, when he was blind and he's standing like this and remembers that training and everything else. I was like 7 or 8 years old and I still remember that scene when I saw it for the first time. Mm-hmm. And Rambo, like that scene when he burns himself, he puts gunpowder in that wound and burn it. Those are those memorable scenes. Or gearing up in Commando or something like that. We don't have those special scenes that, enchant the audience at certain moments. Plus, if we compare one-liners that they used to have in those action movies, they're also memorable. Now they turn everything into one-liner. So every line in the movie is silly, but it's not memorable. You can't use it. It's not I'll be back moment. You don't have it anymore.
Yeah, because they use the whole less is more method. So if you get like maybe 4 great memorable one-liners in the film is great. Now, when they're trying to like make every line of dialogue memorable, it's like, well, then none of it's memorable, Like you need those special moments like, okay, this is just this moment right here, this scene. Another thing that makes a great action film, by the way, is you can't just have action for action's sake. Like it has to make sense with the story and progress the plot and also ideally reveal characters. So a perfect example of that, and this is one of my favorite films of all time, Rambo First Blood Part 2. Like when he rescues that initial POW from the camp, right? And the action's there because obviously the Russians and the Vietnamese guys are after him as he's racing to the extraction point. But this ties into the bigger theme of the film too, where Stallone even asked Troutman, like, if we can win this time. And Troutman said, this time it's up to you. Well, it kind of wasn't, because look what the bureaucrats did. Look what Murdoch, he just ditched them because he only wanted him to take photographs. But that reveals character for the Rambo. It's like, look, this guy's right here. I am not going to leave him behind. I'm going to save this guy. So, and that propelled the whole story in like a different direction. So again, like that scene is so powerful because again, it's not just an action scene. Yes, it was fun. And, the guys in the helicopter are shooting at the soldiers and Stallone's running to the extraction point with the POW, and real drama where he's grabbing the guy's arm and they're climbing up like that muddy hill. Like that's powerful stuff. And then the look of like disappointment and frustration and anger that Stallone gives to the helicopter pilot after they ditch him, right? Is crazy, man. And then as the soldiers surround him, it's like all those moments, man, are just like burned in your memory. They're so dramatic. Yes, there's action, but there's so much drama in that action, and it advances the story. It turns in a different direction, and it reveals character. So that hit it on every point, man. And I don't think films really these days pay that much attention to that, right?
Yeah. Plus, those openings that used to be in those older movies, like we have in First Blood, in those first 5 minutes, you know who Rambo is. You know what kind of person he is. And not just when he's looking for that friend that he's then, and he realized that he's the last of his unit. The interesting thing is when he was stripped and you can see those marks of torture. And then you have that quick flashback, in Vietnam when they're torturing. That was it. And the first scene you have in Commando was him with his daughter. Now you again know that relationship. How sensitive he is towards this, but also a killing machine. How to explain. So every time with those quick openings and flashbacks, you immediately create that special connection with the audience, and you understand that this character is more than just an action hero. He's not just there to bring justice and to fight or whatever. He's doing it from something that's deep in his heart. He's got values, and you're inspired by him. And not just with his looks, but that's the most important thing for an action hero. We know that, and it's not just the muscles and movement and everything else, the style, complete style of those characters. Everything was memorable, whether it's leather jackets or motorcycles or fast cars, everything was connected to the story. And every time you see them, you remember certain scenes from that. And the interesting thing was when you watch Cobra, like they said many times, it's the most quintessential movie of the 80s. It captured the essence of the whole decade.
Yeah, great points. And again, going back to the character, the way the audience connects, there's got to be certain things there. And like you said, they do feel like real people. They really do. And that's easy to connect with them. In action films specifically, the easiest way to get the audience on board is you got to make them good at what they do, if not the best at what they do. So if you look at a character like Rambo or Commando, etc., they're so good at what they do. And again, it ties back into like the real life actor or star. Like when you got Steven Skull, it's like, yeah, he's a real life Aikido master.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously when you watch him in a film, he's going to be great at what he does. It's kicking ass, basically, and you're totally on board. And you don't get that so much anymore. Like I think I think some really good actors who do great action and have kind of almost molded themselves into becoming that, like Keanu Reeves, ever since he did The Matrix, he became like a real martial artist. He's been doing martial arts for like 20 years. And then even somebody like Tom Hardy, he's actually won a jiu-jitsu competition not that long ago. So these actors became kind of like the real thing, but because they didn't start off as the real thing, they started off as actors, which is great. But you don't get the same connection that you do with someone like Van Damme or Seagal, in my opinion, who came into it as like they were almost mythologized in a way. And you can, really kind of examine their history, and maybe some of it's exaggerated, right? With Van Damme being the European World Karate Kickboxing Champion. Yes, he had fights. Was he an actual kickboxing champion? That's debatable. But nobody knew that back then, and at the end of the day, he was still a karate champion in some way and highly skilled. So you didn't really care so much, right? You just knew this guy could kick ass in real life. And when you watch him in a film, it's just fun watching the guy that could do it in real life do it in this like highly exaggerated, dramatized world of the movie.
Yeah, you would usually expect that action heroes just to have guns. When we had Charles Bronson or Clint Eastwood, Sean Connery, Gene Hackman, they were always with guns. There were not real fights involved there. But over the years, we invested ourselves in those fights. And the moment they started combining with MMA, with all those hooks, the leverages, and everything else, it somehow lost that whole meaning of fight we're used to. They say it's not practical to fight in real life like that. It's not a street fight and you can do a front kick or backflip or whatever. But we still want to see it. It's impressive. It's impressive to see those splits, to see that movement. And Van Damme brought it to the screen better than anyone before.
Yeah. You got to give them a lot of points for style, man. And all these guys in that era had their unique style. Like Van Damme, again, you got to have the right look. So having that muscular body, because fitness and bodybuilding was really starting to get popular, because Pumping Iron documentary, I think, came out probably in, I forget the exact year, it could have been 1977. But basically that kind of got a lot of exposure and interest in bodybuilding. So bodybuilding really gained popularity in the 80s. So it would only make sense that the action guys now in the 80s would have to look the part. Like you just look tougher when you got muscles and you're ripped and everything else. You got to look the part, right? And especially a lot of kids love these action films, man. And we need something to inspire and be motivated by. Like I remember the first time I watched Commando, the first time I seen Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'm just like, wow. Or the first time I seen Stallone in Rambo, I'm just like, I want to look like this. This is what like a real man should look like.
Yeah.
And there's something to it if you think about all the hard work and the discipline that builds character, man. It's not just like you want to look good to look good, man. When you're grinding and sacrificing for years in the gym, working your ass off, it just builds, that certain body. But you have to respect the amount of work and dedication that goes into it. And you could apply a lot of those, principles in your real life. Like I think every man should work out, not just to look better, but basically it builds a lot of character in qualities that you can, put in other aspects of your life to gain success.
Yeah, just like Dorian Yates said, you get hungry, but if you can control that hunger, you can control everything in life, because you're not allowing yourself to indulge those cravings because you're working on something more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one point I do want to make about the action films, it is interesting how basically the way they evolved, a lot of it just has to do with the technology. So obviously the first films with action, I don't know if you want to call them action films, but they're definitely in that subgenre, the Westerns. They can easily shoot those, back in the day for obvious reasons. And then how it went to, more of the 80s and 90s where they had a lot more technology with the pyrotechnics, and they had the urban settings where you could have all these cool car chases. So it opened possibilities to do different things. And the reason why now, like, we got so many comic book films again, is the technology. It's like wire work started to become big in Hollywood, you know, around 2000, especially with Matrix, and then they were bringing Jet Li over and like a lot of Hong Kong influence. And then as CGI got better, it just made sense, I guess, that you can actually have a somewhat believable looking comic book film, because they tried to do comic book films back in the 90s and they did okay with some of them. But basically with technology, it's like, you know, merging the wire work and the green screen and CGI work, it looks real enough now. And they just ran with it. And you also got to figure just what the public wants. Like in this day and age, it's, you know, people just have a hard time defining what a man or a woman is, and they live in their fantasy world. So it makes sense that you would create movies where they're just superheroes living in a fantasy world. It's not even real. But going back to the 80s and 90s, that was like that era of like fitness and martial arts were such a big thing. So obviously our action stars are going to be, you know, buffed up martial art guys that can really fight. But nowadays it's just like, it's just a fantasy thing. People want to be a superhero and they think they can be whatever they say. Like if I told you, well, I want you to call me a unicorn, it's just like, I'm not a unicorn, but I, you know, these people have this weird thought in their head that they could be something that's, you know, not what they really are. And I think that's why these comic book films appeal to so many younger people nowadays.
They don't even live in reality anymore. They're obsessed with some stuff that I don't even know where they're getting information about it. They've been bombed by different sides, different opinions, and they can't even create their own self-perspective and to understand what they are. For me, it's even impossible to think that I'm anything else that I am now. And a lot of that influence was shaped just because I watched Stallone and Schwarzenegger and Van Damme, because that they were my images of myself. That's how I projected myself to be, you know. This is a real man. This is a macho man. He knows how to handle things, but still, he's got a soft side inside to protect his family, to be good with his friends, to be a good person. You know, that's it. So how can you question yourself when you can see you can be something like those guys? But we don't have that anymore. And that's the sad thing. But also
which is very interesting, because if you think about it, all these superheroes, for the most part, have secret identities.
Yeah.
Like they, and again, it ties into like people don't even know how to identify, right? They don't even know how to identify anymore. And it kind of like parallels with what's going on with the superhero thing. And I think that's why those films are so popular.
Yeah. Basically, you're creating split personality and projecting some stuff towards it, because when you watch Rambo or watch Commando, they are what they are. They don't have secret identity. It's what they are. It's what they're meant to be. You know, that's okay. You can understand that Batman has to have it, or Superman. They need to have it, because they need to protect their families. That's the only explanation, or whatever. Batman is there. He doesn't have a family anymore, but he's got friends. You know, he can't expose himself to general public in that way like Iron Man did. But those guys from the 80s and 90s, they didn't need those false identities. They were what they are. And when you mentioned those special effects from the 90s, when you had all those martial artists like in Mortal Kombat, when you had Michael J. White in Spawn or Wesley Snipes in Blade, those were the origins of those comic books, of those superhero movies. And still, when you eliminate all that, how to say, those special effects from that time were just starting. They weren't developed enough. They now look obsolete, and that's the problem. But still, even without it, you still had memorable movies. You had memorable characters and moves. So,
it seems like you know, everything's cyclical though. Like I always feel this superhero genre is going to kind of peter out, die out. People have already lost interest, right? And it seems like guys like David Leitch and Chad Stahelski are kind of bringing that that other type of action back, right? And because they're successful, luckily they could get the right budgets and make really good looking films. So, you know, we'll see what happens. I think David Leitch just recently came out with Bullet Train. That movie's killing it on the Netflix charts.
Yeah, I watched it. It's fun. It's entertaining.
It has its moments. It has its moments. And then John Wick 4 is obviously coming out. They're probably going to do a sequel to Extraction. So they're kind of bringing back more of that real hardcore, you know, rated R action, right? Yeah. Not this stuff for kids who don't even know how they want to identify.
but they're still depending on those stars who are now in their 50s, like Mark Dacascos. And I don't know, when you see them again, it's great to see them on the screen, but it's a shame that back in the 90s or early 2000s, they weren't in those big budget movies. And it's still a problem for a lot of them, like Scott Adkins now. He just can't get a break. He needs a big movie because he is a major star. He was your guest.
Yeah, it was really fun, talking to him, and you could see, like, I think he's representative and symbolic of the frustration a lot of guys who love action have, because he's a guy like us who grew up watching all those great films, and then he got these skills he had acquired being motivated by those films. So he could have been like the next guy. In a lot of ways, he is. But the problem is he's the next guy in a world where that's very like watered down. Like they're not going to give him 10 or $20 million to make a cool ass action film that he could shoot in 2 months. They're going to get, I don't know what the budgets of his films are. Maybe they spend $1 million or $2 million and they give him 2 or 3 weeks. And it's just like, you can only do so much, man. You can only do so much.
And that's the problem. Aside from that you don't have enough budget for the movie, because you don't have the right directors anymore. When you remember, like Sheldon or like John McTiernan, all those guys, they knew how to make action movies. Now everyone is trying to make it. They usually make some dramas or something like that. Then they get like big CGI blockbusters or whatever to direct, and they still can't invest themselves into real action heroes and action characters. They don't understand how to present that action. And just like you mentioned about that shaky cam, it's destroying us. It destroys the scene. The moment you see it, the moment you can't see what's going on in the screen, you can't see the moves, you're losing it. You're losing attention. You can't even watch it because you don't know what's going on. The same thing happened with Taken 3. That movie looked like a mess because you couldn't watch it. You couldn't understand what's going on in certain parts. Because Liam was almost 70 years old when 65 or something, when he made that movie. So they needed to make him look fast, but still it wasn't, it wasn't the real thing that you want to watch.
Yeah, that one gets a lot of criticism for good reason. And see, the issue with people like us who grew up watching the best films in that genre in the 80s and 90s, like we've seen what's good. We know what's good. So when we see something like Taken 3, it's like, what are you guys doing? Like you guys did it right before. Shouldn't things progress? Like it's devolving and getting into an inferior product. It's like things should keep getting better, not worse. So I think that's what really bugs people like us, man.
Yeah, that's the problem, because we're used to this. We want to see a real movie, we want to see those action scenes. We want to learn something from it. That's the thing, because like I say, when you see people who look impressive doing something that's not really common to everyone, not everyone can do all that stuff, just like your helicopter kick, not everyone can do it. You have to spend your life doing and working, on that to achieve that ability. And not people can't really perform something like that, and you want to see that in action. But the moment you start cutting and adding some parts that are not necessary and watering down the whole scene,
yeah, it kind of takes you out of it, because like if the character in the film can't authentically do it, the audience is kind of loses. It's like, wait a minute, this guy can't really do that, Yeah. And then like, how am I going to feel that he could basically save the world or whatever like mission he's doing? It's like, well, that's why the guys like Seagal and Van Damme, pulling the camera back and seeing everything. It's like, this guy could really do this stuff, man. I totally believe he's going to save the day, right? But then with a lot of films now, it's like, this guy can't even do it in the movie. How am I, like, I'm just kind of taken out of it, right?
And also the problem is they're creating, gender-based movies, and you can see those characters, they can't even do regular stuff and not just something dangerous. And for example, I talked with my friends recently about the movie Prey, and it's got like 93 or 92% positive reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. Imagine Predator, original Predator, it's got 80%. And you can see that girl that's around maybe 100 pounds, 80 pounds, throwing Predator around, making him run for his money or whatever. That's the same predator. You need to keep in your head. That's the same predator who fought with all those special forces. And Schwarzenegger, who's like 6'2", a mountain of muscles, couldn't stop him. He held him like this. And this girl is throwing him around. So you're not saying it's not possible that girls can't be superheroes and do all that stuff, but you need to find the right woman. I would absolutely believe that Ronda Rousey and Gina Carano could do it. Absolutely. No question about it. But
yeah, Gina Carano at least has much better acting chops. So the problem with Ronda Rousey is she had a chance and she came across as a horrible actor, unfortunately, but she's doing really good in the WWE. Yeah. But see, the thing with Ronda Rousey, I'll tell you what really killed it though. So even if she wasn't a great actress, the thing that killed it is the mythology died when she started losing in MMA. Like when she was literally like a figure that Joe Rogan was saying, I think she could beat up men. Like Mike Tyson was even saying good stuff about her because she seemed undefeatable. And you needed that for her to basically, if they were going to go ahead and do that Roadhouse reboot with her, which they talked about for years, it would work until we seen her lose against a woman. Yeah. So how the hell is she going to beat up 10 guys in a bar if she can't beat up one woman in the cage? So that's kind of an interesting thing that happened to her. Is like the whole mythology behind this like woman that could probably kick guys' asses. It died once she lost in the cage. Then you're never gonna, your suspension of disbelief died with it. And then you can't put her in that kind of a movie, man.
Yeah, if she retired years before it, then it would be possible, to keep that attention.
Yeah, and again, you would go along with it even if her acting was horrible because it's like, well, we're looking at the real thing. She probably could mop up these dudes in a bar, right? But
I like to see
that's
that
an
because
interesting history.
We used to have characters like Sarah Connor, Ellen Ripley. We grew up watching them, and we knew it's possible they could be action heroes. We never questioned that. But now they're forcing us to accept certain girls that are not action heroes. They don't have all the attributes. They don't have the movement or strength or anything to fight with 10 guys at the same time.
Well, it's like an agenda. Like they didn't have an agenda back then. They could create real characters. They just happened to be female. We didn't question it because they felt authentic. Now they just feel shoehorned in. It's like, hey, let's do another Predator movie, but let's put a woman in there. It just feels forced. It's like because again, you figure you picture Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I think men in general, like we need those strong role models again. I don't think we're not getting that with superheroes, and we're not getting it with 100-pound women beating up, 200-pound men. Like it's just like as a boy or a guy watching that, it's like, dude, guys just look pathetic these days. Unless you're literally a superhero, men are just beyond pathetic. Like we need these Arnolds and Stallones and Van Dammes and Seagals just kicking ass again, man.
Exactly. And that's what's missing. David, so much for this wonderful conversation. We covered so much of it, and there's a lot more, but we don't simply have enough time. But if you're interested, you can continue watching it. Absolutely check David's channel, Viking Samurai. He's got a lot of interviews with famous movie stars. He's got great movie reviews, and you can learn a lot about martial arts and staying in shape. So that's it for today. Thank you, David, so much for being a part of my channel. And we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a fun discussion.
Yeah, it's great. All the best. See you soon.